Hello, and welcome to the Angus and Pete Show. Views and opinions are strictly those of the presenters and their guests and should not be taken as advice. Goodness knows, we're not qualified to advise you about anything. Side effects may include mild amusement and occasional enlightenment with feelings of embarrassment, apathy, disappointment, and pity.
Welcome to episode 11. I'm Angus Pacey.
And I'm Pete Brown, and we are the Angus and Pete Show.
This is the place where you can listen to two guys chatting about that riveting world of customer engagement.
You know, customer engagement, otherwise known as call centre, contact centre, customer service, customer experience, CX, etc., etc.
If you want to know more about us, just check us out on LinkedIn. So, what is in our post bag this week?
We have something in our post bag, which is always reassuring. The first post is from Oka, and Oka is in Amsterdam.
Okay.
And she says that I'm liking the podcast. It's different to others that she listens to because it sounds like we're just having a chat. And she asks, is it scripted? How do you know what to talk about? It's quite easy to answer that question, actually. We are having a chat. It isn't scripted. And we don't know what we're going to talk about until the last minute. That's the whole point, I think, isn't it? We're sort of making it up as we go along, which we hope leads to some level of spontaneity.
Yeah, but we do put a couple of bullets together in the half an hour before we start recording.
We do, but we're flying by the seat of our pants, Oka, which all adds to the dramatic tension of the whole thing as far as I'm concerned. The next one was from Steve in Barcelona. Now, some of you may know Steve because he's been around the block a few times in the old customer experience.
Yeah, he does not have a Spanish accent. Let's just say that.
He's in Barcelona. Anyway, he says, I used to be an analyst, one of the better ones, he says. And he's just listened to episode 1, A is for analysts. And he thinks that he was at one of the events that you spoke about because he's still got a branded rubber duck kicking about in his house somewhere. So I guess that just goes to show that at least some of the stuff we talk about is based on real events.
That's a good proof point. I hope that branded rubber duck is in his house in the most prominent position as a prized giveaway.
I'm sure it's a prized possession, and actually, if it's lasted this long, it speaks of quality merchandise, which is always a good thing. And our third post is from Daryl, and Daryl's in Phoenix, Arizona, which I believe is in the United States. And he says, I've just been promoted from a business development role that was 100% focused on the US market. And his new role now includes the EMEA region, Europe, Middle East and Africa.
Okay.
And he's a little bit intrigued by what he's hearing from his colleagues in EMEA who are telling him that the EMEA market for CX and customer engagement technology is complex. The market landscape is different to the US. And he's got a fairly basic question. As far as he can see, he's looked at the map and it looks like Europe, Middle East and Africa. It's 50 plus states. How different can it really be? That's his question. And I think that's a great subject for a rambling 25-minute chat. We're not going to try and unpick all the geopolitical nuances of Europe, Middle East and Africa, but we can give him some headlines. Right, Angus?
This is a massive topic.
We'll give it a go.
We'll give it a bash and see if we get 2 episodes out of this one.
So high level, I thought, let's throw some stats up in the air and see if that helps. So generic numbers, here are some differences between Europe, Middle East and Africa as a region and the United States. So the first one, let's talk about population. In EMEA, there are around about 2.5 billion people against a US population of about 330 million.
That's roughly 8 times bigger than the USA's.
Yeah. Land area, I've decided to do this in square kilometres because I know how much the Americans love a little bit of metric. EMEA is 39.1 million square kilometres to the US's meagre 9.8 million square kilometres. So EMEA is 4 times larger. The number of countries in EMEA does vary depending on what sources you look at, but I think we can agree it's 100 plus.
Yeah,
right, Angus?
It definitely is, because sometimes they include Russia into that. Which Eastern European countries get included? The borders are fuzzy.
So that's 100 plus in EMEA, 1 country in the USA.
So we're 100 times bigger in terms of countries.
We are. Internet users. There are 1.2 billion internet users in EMEA. There are about 312 million in the US. So again, you're looking at 4 times the number in EMEA. When you look at the workforce, there are 1.1 billion workers in EMEA versus 165 million in the USA. So up to now, EMEA is bigger, but there is one number, some would say the most important number, and that is GDP. For all of its scale and size, EMEA does have a slightly bigger GDP at $32 trillion, but the USA is close behind with $26.9 trillion. And when you look at that per capita, they're doing pretty well. So there's some high level numbers. You and I have travelled around there. We know a little bit more than just the high level stuff, right? We've experienced EMEA in all its glory, and it is a glorious place, a very diverse place. We've done our specifics in customer engagement and contact center and CX. Let's talk about what we've learned and try and give people some useful pointers about what is the difference between EMEA and the US. A lot of our vendors in the customer engagement, CX, contact center space are US based. And Daryl isn't alone in wanting to know why it can look so bloody difficult sometimes from across the pond. So what have we learned? What can we say that might help?
I'm not surprised Daryl is struggling to get his head around it. I certainly went through that learning curve. You don't learn what the differences are until you experience them. It's one thing reading about them on a slide. It's very different actually landing in these places and seeing what the difference is. So if you think about huge and diverse population with loads of different people, language and cultural complexities hit you in the face pretty rapidly. 2,000 odd different languages spoken across EMEA and all the different regions.
Yep.
A lot of different dynamics that play in terms of the economics. A small country can have a huge GDP relative to the number of people. And you've got to look at those dimensions very carefully. We throw all these acronyms around like EMEA, but then other acronyms that come into play. I had this today. We're talking about CEE countries, and I had 3 people on the screen looking at me with absolute blank faces. Central and Eastern Europe. It's bleedingly obvious when you know what the acronyms are, but let's simplify this down a little bit. What are the 4 key things from a CX perspective that people need to think about?
Okay. So we've got a large, diverse population. We've got linguistic and cultural complexities. You said big countries by population don't necessarily mean big opportunities. The largest countries in EMEA by population are countries like Nigeria, Russia, Ethiopia, Egypt, the Democratic Republic of Congo. They are not necessarily a good starting point to set up a CX and customer engagement practice. Population size isn't necessarily a predictor of success when it comes to the sorts of things that we're selling under the customer engagement and CX flag.
Yeah. I mean, 2024 stats are not readily available yet. So you look at 2022-23, that market was bigger than $1 billion in revenue from a CX perspective. That's a headline number. So, big revenue number.
Just to be clear, we're talking about cloud services. So that doesn't include all of the legacy tins. We're talking about the shiny new world of as a service. Okay.
The one that everybody's talking about. They're not focusing so much on the old world at all.
Okay.
So you've got a value that they're saying is going to grow to sort of 3.5 billion by 2030. Compound average growth rate bigger than 16%. It's significant growth. If you look at the individual countries and regions, you've got to look a little bit deeper than that. You go to the UK, they've got somewhere between 700,000 and 800,000 agents in the contact center space. So it's materially a very big market from a contact center perspective, a customer experience technology perspective. And you go to Germany, which is a big market in Europe, it's down at sort of 500 to 600,000 agents. So it is a little bit smaller than the UK, but then that market's characterized as a slow adopter market.
Right. And is there anything about the whole customer service ethos and the way that people like to be served that contributes to that? Do Germans do stuff differently?
I think you're talking about cultural sensitivity here. And I think this is where one size absolutely does not fit all.
Right.
Yeah, the language is important. I mean, the German guys want everything in German language. They do not take kindly to having English pushed down their throat for some reason. And words translate differently. We actually have seen this in real action where we talked about customer engagement. And the only country in EMEA where customer engagement as a two-word phrase does not work is in Germany, because when you translate it into German, it's about 6 meters long.
Yeah, yes, it is. Yeah. So they changed it, right? They have their own language. So the whole thing around localization and sensitivities and those sorts of things, you don't really have to worry about that when you're in the US, but it's certainly a thing that needs to be considered in EMEA. I'm just thinking about Daryl and his US focus. Who are the vendors in EMEA that Daryl might know, and maybe some that he doesn't?
You look at all the traditional technologies, you'll see the typical vendors that you see in the US probably. The Avaya, Cisco, Five9, Genesis, Ring Central, 8x8, Sprinkler, Zoom, Puzzle, Amazon Connect, Microsoft, NAS.
Other vendors are available. There's actually local organisations as well, right? What you call local vendors, specific country vendors, people like, well, Puzzle's a good example, I guess, who grew up in the Nordics, and there are others in other areas. So as well as having those global vendors, you've also got localized players who are much stronger when it comes to that localization, but maybe suffer a little bit from their capabilities when it comes to scale.
I think it's not only scale, but it's also their longevity now in the current environment where you need deep pockets to fund R&D into this new AI space over time. So I think those small local vendors, they are very strong. They are very price competitive. They know the local market and they tailored their product to the local market. But I think they're going to struggle moving forward because you need scale and reach to make the business cases to make this stuff work. I think so. So I think that landscape's going to change quite a bit.
Do the standard verticals hold true in EMEA? Finance, healthcare, retail, government, telecom, utilities. Are there any major differences there?
No, they're pretty much the same at face value. When you look at them, you will find exactly the same verticals. There is a nuance that comes in each country generally when it comes to regulatory complexity, because all these countries have got local laws and regulations that they have to take into account. Now, Europe has got strict regulation around GDPR, data sovereignty, data privacy, that sort of thing. And it is very important. It's one of those sort of hygiene factors that if you do not comply with it, you've got a problem. Layer on top of that, you've got small markets that might not be part of the European Union and strictly have to comply with GDPR, but they adopt that as best practice. And then you've got the local implementations and local laws around what you can and can't do with customer data, how you route calls around the place.
And that has a very significant effect on the way that some countries view the whole cloud, the whole as a service thing. I remember learning the hard way that the Swedish government has mandated that if you're in the public sector in Sweden, they're not banning you from using the public cloud, but they're not encouraging you either. There's a whole load of rigor around what you can and what you can't and what you should and what you shouldn't do. And that's Sweden. Different countries have a different view of what's acceptable, what's risky, what's not risky. And I guess the way you learn is by getting your feet wet and going to talk to them.
Yeah, I think you've got to go and speak to them. And I think there's also a difference between regulations that are absolutely written down and conventions that are being followed. And they are just as important. The regulation that says we can't do this, but the convention says we can't do this.
Right. Okay.
Middle East, which has got multiple different small kingdoms with different legal frameworks, they are definitely starting to move to the cloud at different speeds in the areas, but also in different verticals. And private sector gets looked at differently to public sector. So these complexities have got to be understood, and you've got to talk to your local people.
So it sounds like we're describing a fragmented market. You've got a relatively uniform way of doing things in the US, and you've got a relatively, what's the opposite of uniform?
Disjointed
approach in Europe, Middle East and Africa, with 2,000 languages, 24 official ones, and everything that goes with it. One size doesn't fit all. We've spoken about regulatory complexity as well. What about the cultural stuff and how that affects the way that you do business and the way that you have meetings? What does that look like?
It changes everywhere you go. Now, take the standard stereotypes. Germany is very structured, on time, happens in German, people are never late. Switzerland is an even more extreme case than that. You go to Italy, it starts changing. I mean, we were in Italy running some training a couple of years back where the guys went to lunch.
They did.
We said, is 45 minutes good for lunch? Everybody agreed with that, and they came back an hour and a half later.
They did. They had to finish their wine.
And that was perfectly acceptable to them. If you go to the Middle East, the starting time is slightly more flexible. But then certain times of the day when the guys need to go and have prayers, those times are not flexible. And you've got to take those into account.
Do you remember when we went to do that session in Norway, in Oslo? It was in the summer, and we start this training session at about 8 o'clock, and 11 o'clock comes round, and they say, right, we need to stop now. Okay, what, 10-minute break? No, it's lunchtime. 11 o'clock, yeah. And then they explained that because we are very close to the Arctic Circle, and they were all up and buzzing at about 2 a.m. because the sun doesn't set. So they have lunch at 11 o'clock. All of these little things contribute to life's rich pageant, and you need to be aware of them. And you only really find out when you're there. So I guess you can't know everything, but you can have flexibility and you can have an open mind, and you cannot make too many assumptions about what you're going into, particularly if you haven't been there before.
You need to get briefed and brief yourself as much as you can before you go to these places, because it's not difficult to operate in these countries. Everybody is super friendly. They're hospitable. They're there to help you. They want you to succeed. But please do not walk in the Middle East and try and shake hands with everybody in the room. From hard experience, it is a very uncomfortable moment when you put out your hand to shake hands with a woman and she just looks at you. I've done it on numerous occasions.
Yeah. How does all of that affect the sales and marketing approach?
The first thing I would say is that your go-to-market approach has got to be specific to the country or the group of countries that you're in. In general, the EMEA market is very channel-focused.
Okay.
So go-to-market via the channel, mainly because it's the only way you can scale in so many different markets. So you rely very heavily on partnerships with the resellers and the sellers, and also the distributors that play a role there, because people forget, even although we're moving into the cloud, you don't shift boxes anymore, you've got currency issues, you've got foreign exchange, you've got dealing with credit lines, all these sorts of levels of complexity, and distributors give you the ability to do that and give you reach. Compare that to the States, I think a lot of those relationships are much more direct.
Yeah. There is a direct and indirect model in the US, but they don't need as many routes to market.
No, it's one country.
So that's another question I've been asked. Why are there so many channels? Well, because of all of the complexities that make up this beautiful place that we call EMEA. So there we go. We've painted a hell of a picture. I'm not sure. If I was Daryl, I'd be rocking backwards and forwards on my chair, maybe going to speak to HR about getting my old job back. We must be able to give poor old Daryl a clue about what actually helps him to be successful.
I think we could probably summarize this in 6 points. Let's have a go. The first one is, before you go into a market, do some detailed research about each country that you want to go into. What are its characteristics? What's the consumer behavior? What's the regulatory landscape? And speak to the local people, and don't argue with them about it. Just listen. Take on board what they are saying, and then decide which markets are the right ones to go, in which order. You've got to absolutely know what that sequence and priority is.
Right, so EMEA isn't a single market. Therefore, you don't have to go and eat the elephant all at once, and you can pick and choose the ones that fit. So actually, when we were talking about setting up a CX practice in the last 2 episodes, there are some similarities there. That discipline around doing your research, picking your fit, making sure that you are addressing a real problem as opposed to an imagined one, so you can make some money.
don't assume that your commercial constructs are the same in each one of these countries. The cost of a head is very different from country to country. So, that research is critical. The second one is think local. And thinking local does not mean you take a data sheet and throw it through a translation engine and it comes out and you can do something in the local language. It's not just about that. Now, you've got to think about what your marketing strategy is in that country, subject to their cultural norms, what works for them. It takes time to build trust and relationships face to face with people before you get traction.
So going back to our 6 points, thorough market research, localization is key for the markets that you're serious about. And I guess what goes with that is investing in local expertise, which could be focusing on building great relationships with distribution and reseller partners in those countries, or it could be putting your own people on the ground, but they are local people. They know the territory, they know the terrain.
Yeah, don't try and drive it from outside. Help the people that are on the ground, invest in them. They know the nuances. You don't need to go and learn them to the same degree. You need to understand them, but you don't need to learn them. The other one, and expands on that, is that you're trying to sell multi-year contracts.
Yeah.
What you're trying to do ultimately is build long-term relationships. This is not a purely transaction. Trust and credibility is critical. Going in there like a bulldozer, all it will do is get you exited as fast as you broke that door down.
In order to build those long-term relationships, you've got to adapt your behaviour to the local market. So you've also got to look serious as well. I.e., you've got to look like you're present. You've got to look like you are there for the long term. You mentioned regulation. There's quite a lot of regulation in EMEA. And I say this as I hear that Elon Musk is systematically dismantling regulation in the US government and anyone else he can get his hands on. So I think those differences are going to maybe widen over the coming months and years. But there's a lot of regulation around a lot of things in EMEA. How much of a problem is that really?
I don't think it's a problem. It's a reality. First off, is I would say. And you're right. I think we're going to have a great big red line drawn down the Atlantic between one way of looking things and another way of looking things.
Right.
Recognize you need to understand it at a local level in the markets that you're trying to penetrate. Don't try and bend it out of shape, because you're not going to be able to bend it out of shape. But if you talk to the local people, they will give you the guidelines and the counsel on how to work within them. The other thing, recognize, you can't just walk in and say, yeah, we can do it, we comply, tick, tick, tick on the data sheet. They will go, where's the proof? Show me, because I'm being audited. And they get it wrong, they in for very hefty fines as well as reputational damage. So they pay very serious attention to this. You can add another part to the compliance piece, and that's the sustainability piece sits at the back, which could be another bullet on its own right. Sustainability we need to think about as well. It is a big thing in EMEA.
And the final thing is, the best way to know this stuff, the best way to learn this stuff is to experience it firsthand, right? Yeah. To go and see and talk and meet and just grasp those social conventions, business etiquette, meeting styles. The more interactions you have, the better. So, Daryl, you have an open invitation to come and join us. In fact, you might want to be a guest on the show, and you can have an input to this interesting discourse on the difference between EMEA and the US. Have we done enough for Daryl, do you think? Have we given him enough to think about?
I think we've certainly given him a whistle-stop tour. Maybe we go down a level and break it down. What's the difference between going into Europe and going into the Gulf, going into sub-Saharan Africa? We can look at some of those differences. We'll ponder on that.
So that's it for episode 11, and we'll be back next time with episode 12.
In the meantime, please follow the Angus and Pete Show on LinkedIn for news and notifications, and message us directly to tell us what you want to talk about, especially give us feedback. If you're sitting in America, give us some tips and tricks on the differences. We'd love to hear that. Tell us how we're doing, and please keep that post bag absolutely bulging.
As you know, the show's available on all your favourite podcast platforms. So listen, like, subscribe, share, help us spread the word.
Hold on, Pete. I know you're gagging to say cheers, Angus, but before we go, it's joke of the week time.
It's joke of the week time. Well, the easy thing to do would be to tell a joke about an American business person coming to Europe. Why, that's too easy. So I thought, we've spoken a little bit about Germany, and it puts me in mind of a story that I like. So I was with a friend of mine, Frank, in Berlin, just a few months ago. We were standing in front of the Brandenburg Gate. And just off to one side, there's a large German flag fluttering in the breeze. And Frank looks at this flag and he turns to me and he says, "Peter, do you know what the colours in the German flag represent?" I said, "No, Frank, I don't." He says, "Well, black is for hard work and efficiency. The red is for hard work and efficiency. The yellow is for hard work and efficiency. And the blue is for our sense of humor."
I'm going to leave that dangling for those that haven't actually quite caught the joke yet, because I bet you this has gone over a couple of people's heads.
I don't think so. Anyway, thanks for listening, particularly my German friends. If you'd like to send me some jokes about the English, I'll read them out next week. But in the meantime, cheers, Angus.
Cheers, Pete.
Thanks for tuning in to the Angus and Pete Show. Remember, it's based on the personal views and opinions of the hosts and their guests. If you're feeling aggrieved or litigious, take a chill pill. There's already enough stress in the world. Don't forget to follow our page on LinkedIn and subscribe on your favourite podcast platform for more episodes. We'll see you next time. Oh, and tell your friends.